Hello, hello, hello. I'm the Chucker, 19.9's resident historian. And on this edition of the 19.9 podcast, we return to Big Blue Nation. This time with Kevin Cook, author of House of Champions, the story of Kentucky basketball's home courts. Released in 2022, Kevin's book is an artful, spirited, and deep look at the venues that have hosted Wildcat hoops, including the Cats' current home of Rupp Arena. Kevin's book also offers rich insight into the stature of UK basketball in and around Lexington. We're going to talk with Kevin today about his motivations to explore Kentucky's home courts, the little-known details he uncovered in his research, and why a comprehensive review of Kentucky's home courts is a worthwhile pursuit. So let's get to it right now.
Now, on to the show.
Yeah, isn't it amazing when Michigan can keep this game to a 19-foot, 9-inch game inside that three-point line? It's all theirs.
Kevin Cook, thanks for joining us here on the 19.9 podcast.
It's a pleasure. Thanks for having me, Chucker. Appreciate it.
All right, so you're in Lexington right now. Kevin, what's the mood like in Big Blue Nation as we talk here in mid-January? It's been an odd season for the Cats so far.
Well, it is. I would say we're probably the fan base is probably on a knife edge. We're not used to it, but we need to see some success over a ranked opponent here pretty quickly. I would say looking at it from a historian's perspective, one thing I found that's interesting is that in the history of UK, starting with Adolph Rupp, I could only find one coach who left sort of on their terms when the fan base and the university administration really wanted to keep them, and that was Rick Pitino. So I guess if you look at history, it's not always a sweet parting. I hope we have a sweet parting at some point with Calipari.
So what is the temperature with Coach Cal there in Kentucky? What's the scuttlebutt?
Well, the scuttlebutt is that I guess those who are cautioning patience, that he's had some other seasons where it was turned around even late in the year, even as late as early March. The 2014 team ended up going to the final game, lost to UConn, but they were doing horrible even at the beginning of March. So it's not March yet. Those who are looking a little more skeptical, which I probably would include myself, is I need to see a different type of, a little more modern offense, a little more aggressive defense. So I can believe in change, but I got to see some differences in game planning and scheming.
Hey, man, Big Blue Nation is an aggressive bunch, man. So you guys take your basketball seriously at Big Blue Nation. So, well, here at 19.9, although we love the current college game, we really love celebrating basketball history. So for you, Kevin, a lot's been written about Kentucky basketball over the years, famous players, teams, coaches, and on and on and on. So tell me a little bit about what inspired you to add to that collection and specifically take a close look at the Wildcats' home courts.
Well, for me personally, sort of my sports journey, goes way back. I was born into a Navy family. My dad was a Navy chaplain, career Navy chaplain. I was one of 4 boys. We were sports fanatics, but we really sort of came of age when we lived in Hawaii, where baseball was everything. But as sort of toward the end of our 3 years there, basketball became more of an interest to us. Folks may be amazed to hear that even the university, it was sort of a golden age for the University of Hawaii basketball team. They had a great player named Tom Henderson, who played on the 72 Olympic team, eventually played for the Washington Bullets. So although baseball was sort of the first love, by the time we left Hawaii and moved for the first time to Kentucky, basketball was taking over in our interest. And then when we moved to Kentucky, my dad was going to seminary in a place called Asbury Seminary, which is close to Lexington in the Lexington area. That was the 74-75 year that Kentucky went and lost to UCLA in the title game, which was John Wooden's last game. And that was just a magical season. We were exposed to another level of sport fandom that we were ripe for, and we went in whole hog. Now, we didn't stay and live in Kentucky all those years. We continued to move around. as a Navy family, but as best we could in the days before ESPN and internet, if there was a game on TV or somehow we could pick up the 50,000 watt station WHAS late at night somewhere in the United States, we would listen to the Kentucky games. So eventually I moved back here in 2000. Part of my training is I have a history degree. I've done some writing, but I've never written a book. But I had a great interest in writing a book on UK basketball. Then the question was, well, what has not been written about UK basketball? A good friend of mine named Doug Brunk, who you know of, the Chucker knows of. He's written a couple of books on UK basketball history. He encouraged me to look at what was out there. And what I found was missing was the story of the arenas. Now, not just about constructing these arenas such as Rupp Arena, but how did they come about? And then how did that affect the program? So that being a foundation of looking at the UK basketball program through the lens of their different arenas. And UK basketball loves the arenas that they played at. They've all been, in the local minds, equal to Wrigley Field, Yankee Stadium, Lambeau Field. There's been several in the history of UK basketball leading up to Rupp Arena. So I wanted to find out more about those, and I found there was little to nothing, which was amazing because everybody shares their experiences about going to these games and with their parents and how they pass that on to their kids. And it was really a family sharing, but there's very little. I thought this is something that's missing. I'm interested in it. I've got a whole shelf of books on baseball stadiums, which are fascinating stories. And I said, this needs to be done for basketball, particularly for Kentucky basketball.
Cool stuff. So let's dive into those home courts. So where do the Wildcats play their earliest games?
Well, I think another thing interesting, if folks that are really interested in Kentucky basketball, they played in a number of different places and they all still exist. But most of them are in different forms. So UK basketball started in 1903. And what they did was they didn't have a basket, really. They built a physical education building like a lot of these early buildings were. You look back at old pictures of, Dr. John Naismith or James Naismith, excuse me, I should know that. And the Peach Basket, it's a sort of a gymnasium, which is
basically dance halls, right?
Yes, weird equipment on the wall, India clubs and weird pulley things, and then usually a running track along that's sort of suspended from the ceiling, and that's what University of Kentucky had. They built that in 1902, started a men's team in 1903. And it really wasn't made. They stuck two baskets on both ends of the running track above, and the court was roughly the square footage of half of a modern college court. There was no accommodations for spectators. The spectators stood on the track or they stood along the walls, which there wasn't much separation between court and walls. And I thought one thing I think is funny is they had all these steam pipes to heat the building. Well, if you're a spectator, you got your back is right against some steam pipes in winter while you're trying to watch the game. I'm sure that was they had some painful burns. The price of being a fan. So that lasted for about 22 years. And actually, there was that gym I'm describing was one wing of a bigger sort of classroom meeting building. On the other side of that building was an almost identical wing where it wasn't ROTC at that time, but there was a Corps of Cadets. It was a military wing of the school that a lot of the men at the school were members of, where they did their marching inside. Well, eventually, there was too much going on in the gymnasium, and there were actually, I believe, 1909, the administration had to get rid of something because they couldn't have all these physical education classes, women's basketball, men's basketball. There just wasn't enough hours in the day to use the one gym. So their decision was, we're going to cut the men's varsity team. Well, the student body was kind of in an uproar, and they convinced the administration to put a wooden floor over on the opposite wing on the other side of the big building, where the what in effect was the ROTC was, hung two baskets from these beams up in the ceiling, and lo and behold, you got another basketball court. So for about 20 years, it kind of went back and forth between the two wings, whatever activities were going on, how they could schedule it. And so eventually, then they had so much interest in the team. They weren't necessarily great in these years. They won one conference, glory year in 1921. That was about the only success they had up to that time. But they wanted an actual basketball is now popular enough that they were going to build a basketball building. And that brings you into Alumni Gymnasium, the first real basketball arena at the University of Kentucky.
And so that comes about when? When does Alumni Gym get built?
Well, it gets built in the end of 1924. They were trying to get the team into it the year before, but as even happens today, you had contractors that were behind, and you had weather, and so the team moved in really a year later. So that's the whole story of the reason it's called Alumni Gymnasium is eventually it initially was going to be financed by the Alumni Association. In fact, that was one reason why UK sort of created a real alumni association, was to build this arena. Well, of course, they got in financial. All of their pledges weren't coming through, and the university eventually had to pick up a large part of the tab. So even though it's called Alumni Gymnasium, that's not wasn't really fully from the alumni, but it got that name stuck on it. But actually, that took a while before they even called it Alumni Gym. Its official name was the basketball building. Very exciting.
Basketball building. All right. Well, it seems every campus has an alumni gym. So let's talk about the one at UK. What made that a kind of a particularly distinctive, special place? What stood out about that venue?
Well, even before, so they were in there for 5-6 years before Adolph Rupp even showed up. And even though they had some good teams, they had some horrible teams. Man, people wanted to see basketball. People not just from the university itself, but the town people, all the Lexingtonians. And so it was sort of one side. It's a beautiful building. It still exists. And it's brick. It's got these beautiful large windows that are just, I don't know how 15 feet tall or what so, that wrap around the building. But the inside's rather ugly and utilitarian. So inside, it basically had two sides of bleachers. It sat about 1,500 on one side, 1,500 on the other.
It's a good-sized stadium for the 1920s.
At the time, it was. Hey, this is a lot. It was. But it was soon filled. And very soon, for the biggest games with the biggest rivalries, they would have people, lining around the court, sitting on the steps up, into the bleachers, sitting on the windowsills of these windows, stuffing them everywhere, really, I'm sure, sending the fire chief, to an early grave, worrying about that. So, and that was all happening in many games, even before Adolph Rupp showed up, even before they had, really the level of success that they eventually would. So there was definitely a fan base very early on. So what's the one thing interesting about Alumni Gymnasium, or Alumni Gym, whatever we call it, is that eventually now Rupp would come in and then everything would go, bonkers, and they would win games at unprecedented rates. They would win 2 national championships, NCAA national championships, while they were there in 1948 and 1949. But in addition to the success of the team, and with the increasing enrollment in colleges and universities after World War II, a lot of it through the GI Bill, which allowed people that couldn't afford it before, if they'd served in the military, to then basically get a lot of their college paid for. You had enormous enrollment upticks in everywhere, including University of Kentucky. So eventually the last several years in Alumni Gymnasium in the late 1940s, only the students got to go to the games. There just wasn't enough room. And even at that rate, they had to split the student body in half. The students had coupon books, and those books you would rip out a ticket and give it as you came in, and the books had a number, and if the number the number was odd, ended in an odd number, then they came on these days, and if it ended in an even number, they came in the other days. So they traded off, and the only way for someone from the public to get into those games was to either buy a ticket and somehow show themselves to be a student. So you had a lot of very elderly students at those games that were, just people from the town that didn't have a ticket. Or Kentucky played games at the Louisville Armory, and they played a couple of those a year, and people would go and see those.
So Alumni Gym gives way to Memorial Coliseum. And does that happen strictly as a capacity issue, or is there something else that motivates that move?
Initially, it was a capacity issue. So, as we said, Alumni Gym opens at the end of 1924. Within 8 to 10 years, the university and everybody is saying we need something bigger because there's just not enough seats. We thought this was going to be a huge arena. Now it's minuscule compared to the interest in these seats. So that's a continuing story of UK's history is how many seats are there and who controls tickets. So at this point in the mid 1930s, the university is saying, well, we need what we call a field house. You've heard of, we have Allen Field field houses at different schools. For Kentucky, that what they meant by a field house was really sort of just a huge building big enough where you could put down a floor, but you could also, I would have a dirt foundation, and the football team could practice, the baseball team could practice all weather indoors. So it wasn't just for basketball, but it was someplace where we could get more seats if we put a basketball court in there. Well, every plan they came up with, they didn't have the money for. It dragged on for years and years. And then eventually, right before World War II, UK gets a new president who is much more much more of a sports fan than previous presidents. And he realizes that the better UK does in sports, football and basketball, the more money they get from the state legislature.
So he sees sports as a marketing vehicle.
Yes. Everybody
ahead of his time.
So they start inviting the state legislatures to come to games, and throwing some after game parties to show, hey, look at this atmosphere. Wouldn't it be great if we had more seats? So, but it never really comes together. And right before World War II, with the new president, it's going to happen. There's enough money, and they're going to build this arena. They haven't got a final plan yet. And then World War II happens, and everything nationally is put on hold. There's not very little civilian construction. All of the resources, steel, wood, it's all going into the war effort. So everything's kind of put on hold. But UK knows that at the end of the war, this arena is going to be built. So a couple things happened during the war. Number one, the idea changes from just a field house to this can be a state memorial. It can be a basketball arena, but also a state memorial to honor all of the Kentuckians who gave their lives in the service of their country during World War II. And so that's one thing. So now it's going to be really a state building on the campus, owned by, run by the university, but it also gets a lot more state funding because of that. And then the second thing is they start buying up land to put where Memorial Coliseum eventually will be. And some of the controversy now, though I'll be honest, it wasn't as controversial at the time, was where they built Memorial Coliseum, the footprint is an historical Black community. And that came about from the history of Lexington when that community initially was established. It was basically owned by white landlords, and they would rent the homes to Black tenants. And it was one of the few places that the Blacks residents at that time, could live. But they had a thriving community. But it came to be when the university grew, it became right across the street from the football stadium of the University of Kentucky. So it was prime land. So the university, parcel by parcel, bought that land up. The residents were given time to move. They weren't, kicked out overnight. And at that time, too, it really wasn't part of municipal policy anywhere really to help people move as they were um, as you take their home away. So now there are historical markers. There's two of them at Memorial Coliseum that remember that community. It's called Adamstown. And so there's been more recognition of that, what was there, and what was lost as you put Memorial Coliseum there. So eventually they do build Memorial Coliseum. It opens in 1950, and it is a state memorial to the war dead. And there's almost 10,000 Kentuckians died in the different services during World War II.
And is there something
Yes.
unique about the inscription of the war hero names at Memorial Coliseum? Because I think that's an interesting aspect here, correct?
Yes. So there's several things that incorporated into Memorial Coliseum that remember initially World War II. So what happened, one thing that's very fascinating, is when the university president, his name was Herman Donovan, he was the one that came in and really spearheaded getting Memorial Coliseum built. He made the commitment that every single name would be inscribed in some manner in Memorial Coliseum. Well, now you're talking 10,000 names. That's a lot. So how are they going to do this? Well, they had some experience in the past. There was UK had an engineering professor named John Horine, and he was well known for his calligraphy. And if folks don't know what a slide rule is, they can look it up. It's a pre-computer. It's sort of a mechanical device with slides and things. That's what people used to do numerical calculations. And if you're an engineering student, you had a prized, very expensive slide rule, and it came in a special case. And Dr. Horine would, for the graduating engineering students, he would inscribe their name onto this case using his calligraphy. And he would also inscribe a number of the different certificates that people would receive in recognition of things. So he was well known. So to backtrack a little bit, after World War I, UK, it took a few years, but they built a building. It's called Memorial Hall, and it was to remember the World War I dead from the University of Kentucky. There's about 2,800 names. And what they did was this Professor Horine, he hand calligraphied all of those names onto these huge sheets of paper. And then they were put in frames and they were hung in this Memorial Hall. So now we fast forward to Memorial Coliseum, and he agrees to do the 10,000 names. So he goes on a semester sabbatical, basically, and he handwrites 10,000 names on, I forget how they're huge sheets of paper, and they are hung in the up on ramps that people used to take when they entered Memorial Coliseum. Now, as we go on to the Korean War, there are more names added. I believe Professor Horine did those names as well. As time goes on and he's no longer with us, names were added for the Vietnam War, even through the Afghanistan, Middle East conflicts. So those things continue to be updated in Memorial Coliseum. Many people don't see them because many of the spectators now enter the way the configure is to enter Memorial Coliseum, which still has women's basketball, gymnastics, volleyball. Memorial Coliseum, the men don't play there; they play at Rupp Arena, but it's still a vibrant, well-used athletic arena. But many people do not see these names. But in addition to that, those were all the Kentucky residents. They did an extra thing for students or faculty staff from the University of Kentucky who also died during World War II. And there are about 300 bronze stars, which are put on the walls of the concourse that people can see. Most people have no idea what those stars mean, but they'll have the dates of either that the student attended the university or the staff or faculty worked at UK, and they'll be on there. And then a final thing to commemorate World War II, when they dedicated the arena in 1950, there is etched in stone from a stonemason. One of the things is a poem. It's called "For the Fallen," which at the time was a well-known poem in remembrance of those who fall during war. And they have the first few lines of that poem. So it was very meaningful. The dedication had almost 10,000 people coming to the dedication. Many of them family members of these fallen Kentucky citizens. It was very moving. They did it on Memorial Day, and so it has quite a meaning that a lot of people have forgotten and are not aware of, unfortunately.
Yeah, some thoughtful touches there from in Memorial Coliseum, coinciding with that is really the rise, the fast rise of Kentucky hoops on kind of the national scene in the 1950s into the 1960s, accelerating from those national titles there in the late 40s. So, is Memorial Coliseum? Does the same thing happen to them that happened, or the same thing happened to Memorial Coliseum that happened to Alumni Gym? Capacity is an issue again?
Well, okay. So, as an historian, I hear things and then I want to get back to the root. What's the true story? So I kept hearing, sort of reading of people as they would reflect back on Memorial Coliseum. Oh, when it was built, it was seen as a white elephant. In other words, it was too big. People couldn't fill it. Well, then they said the same thing about Rupp Arena. But I thought, okay, what's the true story? What was said at the time? At the time, people thought they could fill it. There were a few, mainly the UK president, Herman Donovan. He was getting cold feet, worrying if they could fill the arena. If you go, originally, Memorial Coliseum was built sort of like a horseshoe inside. There was one wall with no seats. They could put up temporary bleachers, but the permanent seats went around only on three sides. Today, the one of the sides is now incorporated into another area, and those seats are gone. There's fewer seats now than when it opened. When it opened, it seated 11,500.
Massive in 1950.
It was, and that's we're talking 3-4 times what they were having in Memorial Coliseum. However, Adolph Rupp really wanted at least 15,000. He wanted it all the way around, and there's a story which is corroborated by both the lead architect of Memorial Coliseum and Rupp. Both were quoted in different interviews over time as saying that at the dedication ceremony, Rupp leaned over to the lead architect, his name was John Gillick, and said, "It's still not big enough." So that would prove to be true. They could have always had much more than 11,500, and they often did with standing room. They get close to 14,000 on a time or two.
Well, Coach Rupp gets his wish, right? Because in 1976, and since 1976, the Wildcats have called Rupp Arena home, and this is obviously the arena most fans associate with Kentucky basketball. So how did the Rupp Arena project come to be? Because we know in 1950, Rupp says, this ain't big enough, but it's 26 years later that Rupp Arena opens, which, is not terribly long. That's a short window, I would argue. So how does the Rupp Arena project come to be?
Well, it was really a grassroots effort, and I'll preface this by saying that what I'm going to talk about here is happening in the late 1960s, and that's at the same time where the University of Kentucky is looking to get a new football stadium. Back in the old days, the UK football field was right across the street from where Memorial Coliseum still is. It's amazing how close together they were. They're in each other's shadow. It's freakish. You can look at, I have in the book, an aerial view from the 50s, and you won't believe how close they are together. But so it's known that UK is going to get a new football stadium in another location, somewhere south of the campus at that time, where it now stands. It was now Kroger Field. And that is where the stadium eventually was put. But back in the late 1960s, there was really a group of three men, a dentist named Roy Holtzclaw, a engineer named Elbert Ray, and then a CPA named DeWitt Heisel. And so together, these men formed what they called themselves the Alley Cats. Now, they knew that the retirement age of Adolph Rupp was approaching in the late 60s. The state, and UK being a state institution, would have to follow this. Is that when he turned 70, he'd have mandatory retirement. Now Rupp fought this, and they tried to get the state to give him a special waiver. That did not come about. But in the late 60s, people didn't know if Rupp was still going to stick there, but this group of men said, well, we need a bigger arena to honor Rupp and call it Rupp Arena. And the initial meeting between two of them was really just at a local eatery after a basketball game at Memorial Coliseum. So they they were very involved in the community. They're community leaders. They started to gather a group of community leaders to say, how can we make this happen? And they together said, well, we need a feasibility study. So they spent about a year going, people within this group, again, just independent, community leaders, no connection, official connection to the government or to the University of Kentucky, did it on their own time and dime, did a feasibility study. They went to BYU, they contacted other universities and said, how did you build your arena? How's the best way? And then how do you make it this big, and how can we make it profitable? So they came up with this whole feasibility study, and they presented it to the university and to the governor. And so the governor then had a meeting with the university president and some others, including these community leaders. And the governor said, well, you're asking for a football stadium and a basketball stadium. What do you want? And according to those in the room, the university president at the time said, we'll take the football stadium now. We just want, quote, half the loaf. And the governor said, are you sure? He said, yes. So the decision was made just to go for the football. Now, the legend is true, but the thinking is that president at the time he wasn't from Kentucky. He had he was from outside the state and he really didn't understand the basketball.
I was going to say probably one of the few times in University of Kentucky history that football has been placed in front of basketball in the pecking order.
Yes. But according to the study, Rupp Arena would have been built right next to where our football stadium is now, south of the main campus, and it would have shared parking. So the Alley Cat group then said, well, okay, it's not going to be on the university campus. However, the city has been looking for some type of civic center as part of an urban renewal project, which a lot of cities were going through in the 1960s. There was a lot of federal money available if a city to revitalize downtown could come up with a plan. And so Lexington had a plan. They just needed sort of an anchor, some type of civic center. Well, then the Alley Cats take their feasibility study to the Lexington government and say, what about Rupp Arena? They say, it looks great. And so it's not quite that simple. And it took a few more years, but eventually that's why it's a downtown city-owned facility and not on the university. Now, they knew that in order to make this a go, we're still going to have convince the UK men's team to play in Rupp Arena. And the university president was sort of skeptical. It was like, well, can you fill it? How are we going to get the students there? Because this is several blocks from the university. Are the students going to walk there? And because I didn't mention this, but the whole idea was, well, if we're going to build this arena, it's got to be the biggest.
23,000 seats, right?
Yeah. At that time, BYU's arena, which was all bleachers, no theater-type fold-down seats, only bleachers, they had roughly 22,000 seats. Now, since that time, they have less seats now, but the goal was, well, we got to beat BYU. We got to make it number one in terms of size and seating. And so originally the vision was 28,000 seats. Originally, that went down to 23,000. One person who got cold feet was Adolph Rupp. Because
he only wanted 15,000.
Correct.
Back in the day.
He was all for, a million seats until in the early 70s, it's very clear that the university is not going to extend his retirement age. So he starts sort of saying in private, well, if I'm not coaching, I don't know if we can fill this. And he even did an interview right before Rupp Arena opened to one of the local newspapers, where he said, well, it's a great arena, and I'm honored that it's called Rupp Arena. I don't know if we're going to fill it when, Mississippi State comes to town, which at the time was, not, they've done better since and had ups and downs. But anyway, that was sort of his benchmark. Mississippi State comes to town. I don't know if we're going to fill it. So that did not turn out to be true. They filled it from the beginning. But that's why it's city owned and not university.
And that's an interesting thing that I don't think a lot of people would know is that the university doesn't own Rupp Arena; it is city owned. Give people for the uninformed, never been to Lexington. Tell us a little bit about like Rupp Arena to campus. Like if students want to go from campus to the arena, I mean, how easy is this to do? And
Well, it's not that far to walk, and a lot to walk. It's depending on where your dorm is. But if
of
you're
course,
if you're on
yeah.
the edge of campus, it's probably three blocks to get there.
Oh,
And and to be honest, because there's not a lot of people park, in out of the way places. A lot of people are walking further than that to get there. It kind of reminds me of a tailgating. I mean, people aren't tailgating, but in terms of the buzz, people come early. I know, this year we're taking, last couple of years taking kind of a hit. Uh, a lot of venues are kind of not maybe getting the in person attendance every game, and Rupp Arena is no exception to that. While it may be sold out on paper, the what's going through the, what's going through
whatever we
the
call turnstiles today, right?
turnstile, yeah, that can be down. Um, but it's still, compared to every place else, it's still very strong. I guess, in terms of what makes it unique, it used to be, hey, we're the biggest and we have more seats. They've decreased that because they put fold down seats in a lot of the places that used to be just bleachers. So that means fewer people can sit there, but they sit more comfortably. But they're doing a lot of renovation inside and out. So it's there. I think more of the prestige is coming from the overall arena and experience, and not just how many, actually
Oh,
fannies are in the seats.
and
So it's a
certainly
great, yeah.
the allure of the arena is what's taken place on the court in the arena too for Kentucky hoops over since 1976 with from Kyle Macy and Jack Givens to Jamal Mashburn to the Unforgettables to Sam Bowie to let's go forward Anthony Davis, and I think that's certainly the allure of Rupp Arena is who's played there in those games that have taken place there. So as you research this book, Kevin, I want to get a sense of just a particularly compelling or unexpected nugget or two you came across. Because when you dive into the research, there's some things you find where like, oh, I've never heard that, or I never would have thought that. So what's a compelling, interesting little nugget or two you came out with?
Well, I'd say one thing interesting is obviously, when you leave an arena, you want to leave that arena in glory. Um, and yet, when Kentucky left both Alumni Gym and in Memorial Coliseum, there was almost a very embarrassing defeat. Now they avoided it. So if we go back to Memorial Coliseum when they left there in the end of the 49-50 season, and the next year they're going to be Memorial Coliseum. At that time, Kentucky had an 83 game home winning streak. One more game to play, and they're playing Vanderbilt. And lo and behold, somehow they're just not playing well. Their big star, 7-foot All-American Bill Spivey, is not playing well. And they're behind. I mean, like 10, 12 points about the whole game. The legend is that at halftime, Adolph Rupp said, boys, if it comes down to the final seconds and it looks like we're going to win, I'm going to do something to this building that will make sure we don't lose. Well, the implication was that, I don't think he would really do it, but he's saying, hey, I'm going to burn this building down rather than lose. Well, in the second half, an amazing comeback. The fans get into it, and Kentucky pulls out this amazing win, beats Vanderbilt. Then they move into Memorial Coliseum. They avoid that. They move in there. And actually, the home winning streak goes on in Memorial Coliseum to a record 129 games. They did not lose like 11 years. They didn't lose a home game. So then, okay, now we go to the end of 1975-76 season, and they're ready to finish up playing Memorial Coliseum. And they're playing Mississippi State, which they should easily beat. And Kentucky's highly ranked. And lo and behold, they are down again. And I forget, I don't have the exact details. They're in the book. But they're down roughly 8 points with just a little over a minute left. And there's no three-point line. There's no shot clock. And Kaywood Ledford, the legendary play-by-play UK announcer that all the old timers know. He basically said, "Folks, it looks like UK is going down in flames." And during a timeout, the Mississippi State players, one or two of them actually come over to the Mississippi State radio team and say, "Mom, we're beating Kentucky." One of those players was actually Joe Dean Jr., who later would be an assistant coach at UK at the time, playing for Mississippi State. Well, another amazing comeback. UK gets a couple steals. They foul a freshman who misses the free throw, and they force overtime. Jack Givens hits like a last-second shot. They go to overtime. They take care of business. They finish up. So that to me was, wow. You know, as great as that team is, they almost blew it twice, and yet the spirit of UK basketball carried them through, and they exited both of those arenas as they should be, as winners.
So the history of UK Homes Courts, from Alumni Gym to Memorial to Rupp, is one of growth, capacity, fandom for the program, right? Rupp is pretty darn big and pretty darn special in the college game. Do you see that that's the end game for UK hoops, or do you see something else on the horizon someday?
Well, a few years ago, I would have thought differently. UK obviously has a lease, and they keep extending the lease. But there's an endpoint to that lease where they could go somewhere else. In years past, there have been sort of not really necessarily serious, but looking at studies of what would it take to come back to campus and expand the seating in Memorial Coliseum, raising the roof, basically destroying the beautiful art moderne front and moving it out. I don't think those would have been done, but I could see them in the past maybe considering building another arena on campus. However, in recent years, the technology and the construction sort of techniques that are available have shown that you can really transform an arena without having to tear it down. They did that with Madison Square Garden.
Soldier Field in Chicago, I think of, football stadium, but yeah.
Yes. So on the outside, Rupp Arena has had it's like a whole different building. It's futuristic. It's beautiful. It used to be on the outside, frankly, look like a warehouse because that's all they could afford at the time. They spent all the money on the inside. So that's on the outside of Rupp Arena, just a totally beautiful new building. On the inside, they were able to, a company had a technique where they overlaid the bleachers in the upper level with these fold-down seats. They didn't have to rip things out. They just went over it. I don't know exactly how they did it. But so those things probably weren't, possible, even maybe a handful of years ago, just weren't available. The biggest challenge I see is they don't have luxury suites. They have a luxury area for, the high roller donors, but they have to leave the arena to go to it. So they can't watch the game. I don't know, they may have to figure out something. I don't know if they can hang things from the ceiling and do it. I don't know. That to me would be the one thing, but I'm much more, I see them as remaining in Rupp Arena because, again, they're not as attached to, hey, we have to have 23,000 seats. They're down below that. What are they at? Like 20,500, roughly. I don't have the exact number in front of me. But that used to be like, man, we've got to have that 23,000 seats. That's not as big a thing now. So if they can add amenities, make the experience better, they got a huge, beautiful new scoreboard in there the last few years. Very striking. I think that now they're likely just going to keep enhancing Rupp Arena and stay there.
Gotcha. Well, we've talked about the past of Kentucky's home courts, and we finished talking about the potential future of Kentucky's home courts and maybe where that will go. That'll be an interesting story to follow, especially in the day and age where there's so much transformation in college sports on so many levels. And so that's going to be an interesting story to follow. So, Kevin, thanks for joining us here. You have House of Champions, the story of Kentucky basketball's home courts. Kevin, we appreciate your time here with us on the 99 podcast and taking us into the history of Kentucky's home courts.
Well, Chucker, it's been a pleasure. I'll talk UK sports anytime. And tonight's been
All right. Well, hopefully it's a better season for you and Big Blue Nation as we move into the 2023 calendar year. Thanks, of course, to author Kevin Cook for sharing his time discussing the Kentucky Wildcats. And thanks to you, our listeners, for tuning in. Visit 199.com for some of the flyest college basketball gear around, and subscribe to our podcast for more shows celebrating basketball history and culture. On behalf of the crew here at 199, this is the Chucker signing off.